I recognized that there was a hidden dichotomy between two populations within the left. One of those populations earnestly wishes equality, and there can be some debate over what it is that is being equalized, but virtually everybody on the left would say that they are for equality of opportunity. Then there is another population that does not wish equality of opportunity. What it wishes to do is to turn the tables of oppression. And the problem for us is that when these two populations are intermingled, they sound alike until the point that you reach something like equality of opportunity, and we are nowhere near that point. At that point, they would clearly diverge, and you would discover that some of the people who had been pursuing some nominal version of equality were really about some radical version of inequity with new people at the head. And I do think that that's what we are facing. And the most confusing aspect of it is that the people who are earnestly seeking something like equality of opportunity are unaware that they have signed up with something unholy and un-American.
Progressives used to say, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. Not anymore. Banning speakers whose opinions you don't agree with from college campuses, that's not progressive. Prohibiting any words not approved of as politically correct, that's not progressive. Putting trigger warnings on books, movies, music, anything that might offend people, that's not progressive either. All of this has led me to believe that much of the left is no longer progressive, but regressive. This is one of the reasons I've spent so much time on my show talking about the regressive left. This regressive ideology doesn't judge people as individuals, but as a collective. If you're black or female or Muslim or Hispanic or member of any other minority group, you're judged differently than the most evil of all things, a white Christian male. The regressive left ranks minority groups in a pecking order to compete in a kind of oppression Olympics. Gold medal goes to the most offended. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that his children would be judged by their character and not their skin color was a liberal idea, but these days it's not a progressive ideal. Today's progressivism has become a faux moral movement hurling charges of racism, bigotry, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, and a slew of other meaningless buzzwords at anyone they disagree with. The battle of ideas has been replaced by a battle of feelings, and outrage has replaced honesty. Diversity reigns supreme as long as it's not that pesky diversity of thought. This isn't the recipe for a free society, it's a recipe for authoritarianism. For these reasons, I can no longer call myself a progressive. I don't really call myself a Democrat either. I'm a classical liberal, a free thinker, and as much as I don't like to admit it, defending my liberal values has suddenly become a conservative position. So if you think people should be able to say what they think without being punished for it, that people should be judged by their behavior, not their skin color, and that people should be able to live the way that they want to live without government interference, then there's not much left on the left for you.
How do we get from that man who was horribly mistreated and I believe killed? We'll find out after the end of the court case. I'm glad that the officer was charged, the former officer. How does that man and the loss of his life at all parlay into Antifa, Black Lives Matter, protests in England and Germany? What are we looking at here?
We're looking at an incredible story because for Marx, socialism would come automatically because of the discontent of the working class. Marx said that the working class, the sweaty guy, the foreman on the dock, the guy who spends 15 hours a day on the job, that's the guy Marx cared about. And Marx thought that guy would become so exploited he would overthrow the system. But that never happened. Working class people are actually fairly conservative. One economist said that socialism never came to America because of roast beef and apple pie. The ordinary guy, when he has a nice house, 2 cars in the backyard, and he can go on vacation once a year, he's not going to want to revolt against the system. He's going to want to join the system. So the left has figured this out. They've realized that today you can't get a working class guy. If you find a white working class guy, there's a very good chance you'll find him at the Trump rally, not in the Antifa parade. So the left realized we need other types of grievances ultimately to sow the seeds of social division. This is when they came up with the idea of identity politics. In other words, let's use racial and ethnic divisions. Let's use gender divisions, men versus women, straight versus gay, legal versus illegal. So if you look at the new socialism of the Democrats today, it's not classic Marxian socialism, because it's not just the rich against the poor, but it is dividing society many different ways. And the objective here is to assemble a coalition of victim groups that together comprises a political majority. That's the Democrats' political strategy. And that's just not Bernie or AOC. That's the mainstream of the Democratic Party. There we are. I call it identity socialism in the book. And by identity socialism, I just mean a kind of marriage between classic socialism and identity politics. This is why the George Floyd episode, by itself irrelevant, but it's essentially become the vehicle, if you will, the Sarajevo shot in the dark that sets off this wider conflagration. So ultimately, the left is using him and using the legitimate horror over what happened in that one case to generalize and say, this proves not only that the cops are racist, but America's racist, we're structurally racist, we've been that way since 1619, and this is taught in the universities, promulgated in the media, it's the plot of Hollywood movies, so no wonder there's a bunch of people who believe it and ultimately pick up a brick and act on it.
You may not realize it, but you are currently funding some dangerous people. They are indoctrinating young minds throughout the West with their resentment-ridden ideology. They have made it their life's mission to undermine Western civilization itself, which they regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal. If you're a taxpayer or paying for your kid's liberal arts degree, you're underwriting this gang of nihilists. You're supporting ideologues who claim that all truth is subjective, that all sex differences are socially constructed, and that Western imperialism is the sole source of all third world problems. They are the postmodernists, pushing progressive activism at a college near you. They produce the mobs that violently shut down campus speakers, the language police who enshrine into law use of fabricated gender pronouns, and the deans whose livelihoods depend on madly rooting out discrimination, where little or none exists. Their thinking took hold in Western universities in the 60s and 70s, when the true believers of the radical left became the professors of today. And now we rack up education-related debt, not so that our children learn to think critically, write clearly, or speak properly, but so they can model their mentor's destructive agenda. It's now possible to complete an English degree and never encounter Shakespeare, one of those dead white males whose works underlie our society of oppression. To understand and oppose the postmodernists, the ideas by which they orient themselves must be clearly identified. First is their new unholy trinity of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is defined not by opinion, but by race, ethnicity, or sexual identity. Equity is no longer the laudable goal of equality of opportunity, but the insistence on equality of outcome. And inclusion is the use of identity-based quotas to attain this misconceived state of equity. All the classic rights of the West are to be considered secondary to these new values. Take, for example, freedom of speech, the very pillar of democracy. The postmodernists refuse to believe that people of goodwill can exchange ideas and reach consensus. Their world is instead a Hobbesian nightmare of identity groups warring for power. They don't see ideas that run contrary to their ideology as simply incorrect. They see them as integral to the oppressive system they wish to supplant, and consider it a moral obligation to stifle and constrain their expression. Second is rejection of the free market, of the very idea that free voluntary trading benefits everyone. They won't acknowledge that capitalism has lifted up hundreds of millions of people, so they can, for the first time in history, afford food, shelter, clothing, transportation, even entertainment and travel. Those classified as poor in the U.S. and increasingly everywhere else are able to meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, in once prosperous Venezuela, until recently the poster child of the campus radicals, the middle class lines up for toilet paper. Third and finally are the politics of identity. Postmodernists don't believe in individuals. You're an exemplar of your race, sex, or sexual preference. You're also either a victim or an oppressor. No wrong can be done by anyone in the former group, and no good by the latter. Such ideas of victimization do nothing but justify the use of power and engender intergroup conflict. All these concepts originated with Karl Marx, the 19th century German philosopher. Marx viewed the world as a gigantic class struggle, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the grasping rich against the desperate poor. But wherever his ideas were put into practice, in the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, to name just a few, whole economies failed and tens of millions were killed. We fought a decades-long Cold War to stop the spread of those murderous notions. But they're back in the new guise of identity politics. The corrupt ideas of the postmodern neo-Marxists should be consigned to the dustbin of history. Instead, we underwrite their continuance in the very institutions where the central ideas of the West should be transmitted across the generations. Unless we stop, postmodernism will do to America and the entire Western world what it's already done to its universities. I'm Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, for Prager University.
Our friend Sam Harris coined an interesting word this week, a phrase, regressive leftists. You know, the people who don't quite get it about being liberals in the world. I know you were championing somebody named Maryam Namazi.
Oh, yeah.
And you and our great friend Salman Rushdie got her reinstated. She was going to speak, as so many people have at universities, and then they get disinvited because she's an ex-Muslim and was just speaking her mind, but apparently that's hate speech in this world. So what did you and Salman...
I am shocked about the way on university campuses, the principle of free speech, when I think that the old university I went to, University of California at Berkeley, the free speech movement in the 1960s, what a betrayal we're seeing now.
Right.
With campuses all over the Western world, all over America and Britain, are denying people the right to come and speak at campuses. If you can't speak your mind on a university campus, where can you? I mean, that's what universities are about. It's about free speech. It's about being brought... It's about being exposed to ideas that you haven't met before, perhaps you're hostile to. If you only ever get exposed to ideas that you agree with, what kind of a university would that be?
But also this notion that somehow Islam and Muslims are this protected species, that if we talk about them at all or criticize at all, it's somehow hurting or humiliating Muslims.
Yes.
And it's a ridiculous idea.
And it's confused with racism as well, because an incredible number of people think Islam is a race.
You know, I found it useful to just be aware of not making life needlessly difficult for myself, and that comes at some expense. I mean, because there is a lack of color and a lack of fun and freedom in the act of communication. When you can assume a modicum of intelligence and goodwill from on the part of your audience, and you can assume that the people who are following the plot will defend you adequately against the people who are maliciously misrepresenting you, well, then you're kind of free to just to have fun on the high wire a little bit. But it's becoming, I mean, it's gotten so bad with respect to my podcast that there are people who will edit the audio of my podcast so as to make it sound like I'm saying the opposite of what I was saying in context. Almost always counterproductive to defend yourself, because it makes it's boring for all the people who are following the plot and who understand that, in my case, I'm not a racist and misogynist and advocate of genocide against all Muslims or whatever. These are kind of the greatest hits of my detractors. The people who know that you're not a genocidal maniac don't need to hear you take that particular foot out of your mouth again and again. And the people who are committed to thinking you're a terrible person are truly incorrigible. They're unreachable.
I've been extremely alarmed by the way campus culture at a lot of our top schools has changed radically just in the last 2 years. There are these new ideas about safety, and I hear undergraduates often saying things like they just take it for granted that a classroom is supposed to be a safe space. Now, if they mean that the teacher shouldn't insult people or people shouldn't, hit each other, of course. But what they mean is that people should not be exposed to ideas that might make them feel marginalized or demeaned. For example, if somebody were to question affirmative action, that could be threatening to students who might have benefited from affirmative action. Therefore, you can't question it. And it's very strange that people are getting in trouble. And I was dragged before the Equal Opportunity Commission for showing a video that in class that one student objected to one word that a student said in it. And then other things similar to that happened to me and then began happening to lots of other people. And this is in the 2013 to 2014 academic years when this all begins to happen. The campus disinvitations, the words trigger warning and safe space, they barely exist before 2012, but by 2014 they're everywhere. A very strange thing is happening, and I think it's so it's horrible because it basically has put a chill on free speech. Everyone is afraid of saying anything that will set off the most sensitive student in the class. Professors all over the country are scrubbing their syllabi clean. We're not showing videos that could provoke. We're not saying things. So education is taking a nosedive in this country because everyone's afraid of a big social media storm or being charged with marginalizing or whatever it is.
This is where we draw the line. This is where we draw the line. This is where we draw the line. Where we draw the line. This is where we draw the line. Let him speak. Let him speak. Let him speak. Let him speak. Let him speak.
Keep your head. There's absolutely no reason to get upset about any of this, right? It doesn't matter. I've had lots of chance to speak on. I'm not in any danger of being silenced. You really want to make sure that you don't let people who are causing trouble provoke you to become stupid. It's a big mistake because a lot of people who are protesting and they're theoretically trying to make the world a better place and trying to provoke a very negative response. And you don't want to be the one to give them what they want. It's a big mistake. When I was... When I was at the free speech rally in Toronto, a lot of people have watched that online now. And it got pretty tense. And if anybody that was there to promote free speech had made a mistake and done something aggressive or violent and had it been filmed and broadcast on YouTube, all of this would have turned out very differently. And so when you're in a tense situation like this, you really have to watch what you do because what you do can be magnified greatly and cause a rippling effect out into the broader society. And you don't want to be... Yes, you're in that trouble. You don't want to be the person who brings that about. Once you start to regard yourself as a victim, you look for a perpetrator. And as soon as you look for a perpetrator, you look for someone that it's okay to hurt. It's really not a good thing. So what I would recommend, perhaps, is that all of you who want to hear me talk, go outside, and I'll come outside and talk.
This kind of protest is an expression of a philosophy that's grounded partly in postmodernism and partly in Marxism. Now, the postmodern element is basically this. There's no such thing as genuine individual identity. What there is group identity. And you, like it or not, only have the interests of your group. And the whole world is nothing but a battleground between groups of different interests. There's no dialogue. There's no possibility of talking between the groups. It's just a power stage where combat has to take place. And so the reason that speakers with whom the radical postmodernists and the Marxists don't agree are denied a platform is because those people do not believe from a philosophical position that dialogue can bring consensus. And all that's left if you forego that particular principle is this. And this is only where it starts. You know, the fact is that you're all pretty damn civilized. And thank God for that. Because if there were enough fools in the crowd, especially those who are intent on violence, this would turn out very differently. Right. And we do not want to go down that pathway. It's a big mistake. We've been down that pathway many, many times. You cannot make people who don't listen. You can't. They have to decide to listen on their own. But you do that by listening. You show them. You engage in dialogue yourself and consensus among you. You do it by example because there's no getting through this. It's an ideological wall. And the harder you push against it, the larger it'll become. Don't worry about it. But don't get pushed around. And don't let people indoctrinate you. And in classes where people push doctrines on you, get your damn arguments together and push back. You know, but you have to be more articulate and more well-read and better educated than the people against whom you're pushing. But that's your job at the university, is to become articulate. And there's nothing more powerful than someone who is articulate. No one ever says that at the university.
It's true.
You go in the library and read great people. Write so that you learn how to think. And talk so that you learn how to speak. It'll make you unbelievably powerful. And that's what university is for. I can't understand why you're not told that. Nothing more powerful than articulate speech. Nothing.
There are many whites who are trying to solve the problem, but you never see them going under the label of liberals. That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox. And a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to. But the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling.
I think there are many whites who act friendly toward Negroes. A fox acts friendly toward the lamb. And usually the fox is the one who ends up with the lamb chop on his plate. The wolf doesn't act friendly, and therefore the wolf has more difficulty in getting the lamb chop in his plate.
I'd like to point out, though, that...
I say that because it is usually if you study the structure of the Negro community, economically, politically, civically, psychologically, and otherwise, it's controlled by the white liberal, who usually poses as the friend of the Negro.